The dry winds of South Sudan moved like whispers across the barren plains, stirring clouds of dust that clung to everything in sight. Far away from paved roads and the noise of cities, hidden between cracked earth and narrow streams, sat the forgotten village of Gorlang. It was a small place, so small that even the government maps didn't name it correctly. A scattering of clay huts, a school built from corrugated metal, and a single water pump defined the life of its 200 residents. They lived quietly, bound by old traditions, farming millet and maize, fishing from the shallow river nearby, and surviving each year with little more than hope and patience. But peace in Gorlang was fragile. The land had seen too much blood in the years of civil unrest. Sometimes armed groups passed through, demanding food or fuel. Other times, military trucks rumbled by on their way to distant battle zones. Yet for the most part, Gorlang had managed to stay invisible. It was this invisibility that made it both safe and vulnerable, protected by its isolation, but forgotten by everyone who could help. In early June 2014, a small group of aid workers from a charity called Frontline Relief arrived in Gorlang after a 3-day journey. They carried boxes of food, medicine, and vaccines, hoping to help the villagers recover from a recent cholera outbreak. Among them was Dr. Miriam Kalo, a 28-year-old medical volunteer from Kenya. She had worked in several African countries, but said Gorlang was unlike anywhere she had ever seen. Silent, almost suspended in time. The group was guided by Jonas Mabior, a local man who had been hired for his knowledge of the terrain and his connections in nearby settlements. He was charming, polite, and seemed to know everyone. The villagers welcomed the group warmly. Fires were lit, songs were sung, and for the first time in months the people of Gorlang felt seen. Children followed the visitors wherever they went, laughing as they handed out sweets and bandages. Dr. Miriam spent her days in the small schoolhouse, converting it into a makeshift clinic. She treated wounds, vaccinated babies, and listened to stories from the elders about past famines and lost generations. The aid workers planned to stay for a week, long enough to stabilize the sick and teach basic hygiene practices before moving to the next village. But something about Gorlang unsettled Miriam. Late in the evenings, she noticed strange footprints near the camp, heavy boot marks too large for the villagers. She told Jonas about it, but he brushed it off, saying soldiers often passed through and that it was nothing to worry about. The other aid workers didn't think much of it either. They were exhausted, sunburnt, and focused on their mission. Still, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. On the night of June 14th, the air felt heavier than usual. The heat refused to fade, and the wind carried the scent of smoke from distant brush fires. Around midnight, a dog began barking at the edge of the village. Then came another bark, then silence. Moments later, screams echoed from the western huts. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Men in dark uniforms flooded the village, moving swiftly and without warning. They carried automatic rifles and torches, setting fire to huts as they advanced. The villagers ran in every direction, but the attackers moved with precision, blocking escape routes and dragging people into the central square. The night was filled with chaos, gunfire, crying, and the crackle of burning thatch. Dr. Miriam tried to protect the injured, pulling them toward the old schoolhouse, but the flames spread too fast. No one could tell who the attackers were. Some wore military boots, others had scarves wrapped around their faces. Their leader shouted orders in a language few could understand. By dawn, Gorlang was gone. Smoke rose from the ruins, drifting into the grey sky like ghosts of the lives lost. When government soldiers arrived 2 days later, they found nothing but ashes, burnt tools, and pieces of shattered glass. No bodies, no survivors. Only the faint outline of footsteps leading away from the village, disappearing into the horizon. The official report described it as a tribal conflict, a violent clash between rival groups over land and water. But the soldiers who searched the area whispered among themselves. They had seen something different: clean bullet casings, military-grade weapons, and tire tracks from modern vehicles no local group could afford. The truth, whatever it was, had been carefully erased. In the quiet aftermath, the name Gorlang faded from memory. It became another forgotten tragedy in a land already scarred by too many. Yet somewhere beyond the reach of the authorities, a single clue still lingered. A half-burned medical bag marked with Dr. Miriam Kalo's name, found miles away near the riverbank. It was the only sign that someone, perhaps, had survived the night the village was wiped from the map. 3 weeks after the burning of Gorlang, the memory of the village was already fading from news reports and official briefings. The story had been replaced by fresher headlines, new battles, political disputes, and empty promises of peace. But in a small fishing town along the Nile, hundreds of miles from the ruins, a young woman appeared that no one could explain. Her name was Lina Ajok, and she said she had come from Gorlang. When the local fishermen found her, she was barefoot, covered in soot and dried blood, and unable to speak for several hours. Her clothes were torn, her eyes sunken from exhaustion. She sat on the riverbank, staring blankly at the water as if it held the answers to everything she had seen. The fishermen brought her to a nearby clinic, where she finally whispered her name and the name of the place she came from. Gorlang. The nurse froze. Gorlang had been erased from every recent report. No one expected to meet someone who still claimed to be from there. At first, few believed her. Government officers questioned her for hours, assuming she was confused or had mistaken the name of her village. But when she described the surroundings, the single water pump, the tin-roof schoolhouse, the shape of the old acacia tree near the square, the investigators realized she was telling the truth. She really had come from Gorlang, and that meant she had witnessed something no one else survived to tell. Lina's story was fragmented at first. She spoke in short, broken sentences, often pausing as if reliving what she had seen. She said that on the night the village was destroyed, she had been sleeping in her mother's hut. The sound of dogs barking woke her. Then came the smell of smoke. When she ran outside, the air was filled with fire and shouting. Men in uniforms were setting huts ablaze. She hid behind a water barrel and watched as the attackers dragged people from their homes. They moved with discipline, not like a tribal militia. Their boots matched, their guns were identical, and their faces were hidden behind scarves. One detail stuck in her memory. The leader of the group had a small tattoo of a black falcon on his wrist. She had seen it clearly in the firelight as he raised his arm to signal his men. She also remembered something else, something the investigators at first dismissed. Dr. Miriam Kalo was still alive when the fires began to die down. Lina saw her being forced into a truck with 2 other people. The attackers did not kill her. They took her. When the government report reached the capital, it was quickly labeled unverified. Officials argued that Lina's trauma made her testimony unreliable. They said her story didn't match the evidence found at the site. No bodies, no signs of survivors. To them, she was simply a confused girl who had escaped an attack and mixed up her memories. But there was one man who didn't dismiss her words so easily. Colonel David Lardo, a quiet intelligence officer known for investigating classified cases that others wanted forgotten. Colonel Lardo met Lina in the clinic where she was recovering. He studied her account carefully, noting the precision of her descriptions. The mention of the black falcon intrigued him. Years earlier, he had seen the same symbol on intercepted weapons linked to a defunct private military group called Falcon Shield. Officially, Falcon Shield had disbanded after being accused of war crimes in East Africa. Unofficially, many believed they had simply changed names and continued operating under different sponsors. The possibility that they had resurfaced in South Sudan was alarming. While others dismissed Lina's words as delusion, Lardo began connecting dots. He compared her timeline with aid convoy records and confirmed that Dr. Miriam Kalo's team had indeed entered Gorlang 3 days before the attack. He also noticed a gap in satellite communication logs, a blackout of signals in that region during the night of the massacre. Someone had deliberately jammed transmissions, something far beyond the capability of local militias. Despite mounting evidence, the investigation was quietly suppressed. Officials told Lardo to close the case, warning that foreign interests were involved. But he refused. He believed Lina's story was the key to exposing something much larger than a single village attack. He arranged for her protection and began gathering data on anyone connected to the aid mission, especially Jonas Mabior, the guide. His records were inconsistent. He had no official background before 2011, and his listed hometown did not exist on any map. Meanwhile, Lina began to remember more details. She recalled hearing one of the men mention coordinates, numbers she repeated to Lardo before breaking down in tears. The coordinates pointed to a remote stretch of savannah far north of Gorlang, a place no aid convoy had reason to visit. It was there, Lardo suspected, that the truth about what happened might still be buried. For Lina, the memories haunted every waking hour. She would sometimes sit silently by the clinic window, staring toward the horizon, whispering Dr. Miriam's name. She was sure the doctor was still alive, somewhere in the vast emptiness beyond the river. What she didn't know was that by telling her story, she had just become a target herself. Unknown to her, eyes were already watching, waiting for the right moment to ensure that the last voice from Gorlang would never speak again. The investigation into Gorlang's destruction had stalled, buried under bureaucratic silence and political fear, until Colonel David Lado decided to take matters into his own hands. Officially, the case was closed, labelled as an unverified tribal conflict. Unofficially, Lado knew something much deeper was hidden beneath that phrase. The story told by Lena Ajok had left too many unanswered questions, and the coordinates she had provided gnawed at his mind like a warning he couldn't ignore. He began searching satellite imagery of the area surrounding those coordinates, comparing data from before and after the night of the massacre. What he found didn't make sense. In the days following the attack, faint disturbances appeared in the terrain: vehicle tracks, temporary structures, and the unmistakable signs of recent human activity. The area was remote, far from trade routes or settlements. There was no reason for anyone to be there, yet the evidence suggested organized movement, not random wandering. Lado pulled older records and discovered that the same location had been flagged 2 years earlier for unauthorized aircraft activity. The files had since been deleted from the defense database, but fragments remained in classified archives. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase traces of whatever was happening there. Determined to uncover the truth, Lado assembled a small trusted unit and traveled to the site without informing his superiors. The journey took days through thick grasslands and crumbling dirt roads, under the punishing sun that made every breath feel heavy. When they arrived, what they found was chilling. The remains of a hidden encampment, hastily abandoned. Scattered tents still stood in the wind, medical crates lay overturned, and tire tracks formed deep scars in the dry soil. More disturbing were the patches of freshly turned earth. The team began to dig. They unearthed shallow graves, each one containing bodies wrapped in torn plastic. Most were villagers, but among them were foreign workers wearing remnants of aid organization uniforms. Identification tags revealed that several belonged to members of Dr. Miriam Kalo's team. It was a grim confirmation that the massacre had extended far beyond Gorlang. Yet there was one name missing from the remains: Miriam herself. Near one of the graves, the soldiers found a rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. Inside were hard drives, flash disks, and fragments of electronic equipment, all scorched but not completely destroyed. Lado's team recovered what they could and brought it back to the capital for analysis. The data they retrieved contained footage from a camera, grainy, incomplete, but horrifyingly clear in moments that survived the damage. The video showed a line of captives kneeling in front of armed men, their faces hidden by masks. The execution was methodical, one by one, until the feed abruptly cut off. For days, Lado studied the footage in silence, pausing and replaying, searching for any sign of who the killers were. Then he noticed something barely visible, a reflection in the side mirror of a truck caught by a flash of light. It revealed part of a man's face, rough and familiar. Running facial recognition software confirmed what Lado feared. It was Jonas Mabayor, the local guide who had accompanied the aid workers to Gorlang. The revelation turned the entire narrative upside down. Jonas had not died with the villagers. He had been part of the group that destroyed them. But why? Further digging into his past exposed alarming details. His employment records were falsified. His travel history linked him to several conflict zones across East Africa. And in one encrypted email recovered from the stolen drives, his name appeared in correspondence with an organization called Falcon Shield, the same name tied to the black falcon tattoo Lena had described. Falcon Shield. Lado remembered was a private security firm notorious for illegal operations a decade earlier. They were said to have worked for governments, oil companies, and arms dealers alike, carrying out jobs too dirty for official forces. After international outrage over civilian deaths, the company had supposedly been dissolved, its leadership scattered. But the presence of their insignia at the Gorlang site proved otherwise. They were still active, still operating in the shadows, and now they had resurfaced in Sudan. Lado tried to present his findings to the Ministry of Defense, but he was met with cold resistance. His report was dismissed, his evidence confiscated for national security review. Within days, several of his files vanished from the archives. Someone powerful was protecting Falcon Shield, and that someone did not want the truth revealed. Lardo realized that continuing his investigation officially would only lead to his removal. Or worse. Secretly, he kept copies of the recovered footage and data. He began to trace financial records linked to Falcon Shield, following the trail of funding that had supported their presence in Sudan. What he discovered was shocking. Several government contractors had made large, unexplained payments to companies that existed only on paper. One of those companies had provided logistical support for frontline relief, the very charity that sent Dr. Miriam's team to Gorlang. It meant the aid mission had been infiltrated from the start. That night, as Lardo sat alone reviewing his notes, a chilling realization settled over him. Gorlang had not been a random act of violence. It had been a cover-up designed to erase something, or someone, who had stumbled upon the wrong truth. And at the center of it all was Dr. Miriam Carlo, the one person still missing. The one who might hold the key to everything that happened in the ashes of the forgotten village. The deeper Colonel David Lardo dug into the web of lies surrounding Gorlang, the clearer it became that the tragedy had never been about ethnic tension or local disputes. It was a carefully orchestrated operation disguised as chaos. Every discovery pulled him further into a network of deception so deep that even speaking of it became dangerous. The evidence pointed to Jonas Mabia, the guide who had led the aid team into the village, not as a victim or a bystander, but as a willing accomplice. His betrayal was not impulsive, it was planned. Jonas had once been seen as a loyal worker, known for his charm and easy confidence. He had gained the trust of charities, soldiers, and villagers alike, often presenting himself as a man dedicated to peace. But his real loyalty lay elsewhere. Years before, he had been recruited by Falcon Shield, the covert private military group that had supposedly dissolved after being accused of atrocities across Africa. The organization had gone underground, surviving by changing names and selling its services to whoever could pay. They trafficked in information, weapons, and influence. Jonas was one of their informants, a perfect insider with access to humanitarian operations and international networks. Through intercepted communications, Lardo learned that Jonas had been assigned to monitor aid convoys for Falcon Shield's hidden financiers. The charity Frontline Relief, which had sent Dr. Miriam Carlo's team to Gorlang, was unknowingly being used to transport smuggled supplies. Boxes labeled as medicine often contained small arms, communication equipment, and encrypted data drives meant for secret buyers. Miriam, being meticulous and honest, had begun noticing irregularities in the inventory. Her shipment lists didn't match the actual deliveries. When she confronted one of the logistics officers about it, she was told to keep quiet and focus on saving lives. But Miriam wasn't the type to ignore corruption. She began collecting evidence, photos of mislabeled crates, copies of emails, and even voice recordings. She stored everything on a secure drive and sent a copy to a colleague abroad, planning to expose the operation once she returned from Gorlang. Jonas discovered her secrets soon after. Reports from Falcon Shield revealed that he had sent a coded message days before the massacre, alerting his employers that Miriam had found sensitive material. The message concluded with a chilling note: containment required. What followed was not a tribal attack, but a purge. The entire village became collateral damage to erase a single whistleblower. When Lardo pieced this together, his disgust turned into fury. The destruction of Gorlang was not only a crime, but a strategy. The killing of witnesses disguised as civil unrest. Yet Miriam's disappearance suggested Falcon Shield had failed to destroy all evidence. They had taken her alive because she knew something crucial, something too valuable to burn with the village. Weeks later, Lardo's team intercepted a coded radio transmission near the abandoned oil fields north of the river. The signal contained a voice pattern resembling Jonas Mabior. It led them to a site scattered with rusted fuel tanks and broken machinery. What they found there was gruesome. In the back of a half-burned truck lay Jonas's body, riddled with bullets. A knife had pinned a folded note to his chest. Written in shaky ink were the words, "She knew too much." The message sent shivers through Lardo. The killers had wanted it found. It was both a warning and a confession. Searching the area, his team discovered traces of tire marks leading toward the border, as if vehicles had left in a hurry. They also found the remnants of a small camp, including an empty metal cage and scraps of blood-stained fabric. Part of a medical coat bearing the faded letters, Carlo. It was the first solid proof that Dr. Miriam Carlo had survived the massacre, at least for a time. Lado realized then that the doctor had become a bargaining chip. She possessed encrypted data linking Falcon Shield's operations to powerful backers in both Africa and Europe. Killing her immediately would have risked losing that information. Keeping her alive meant they could extract it. But by killing Jonas, Falcon Shield had silenced the one man who could confirm her location. When Lado attempted to escalate the findings, he met only obstruction. His superiors ordered him to stop wasting resources on what they now called a dead-end investigation. He was told to hand over all materials and focus on national security matters. The warning was thinly veiled. He was treading on the interests of people far above his rank. Files began disappearing from his office, and his phone was tapped. One evening, while driving home, he noticed a black SUV following him for several miles before vanishing into the night. He realized he had become part of the same shadow war that had consumed Gorlang. Still, he couldn't walk away. Lado copied all his research, storing it in secret locations. He began reaching out to international contacts, journalists, former operatives, anyone who might be willing to expose the truth. But the world had already moved on. The only thing keeping the story alive was a handful of files, a murdered guide, and the faint hope that Dr. Miriam Kalo was still out there somewhere, holding the final piece of evidence that could unravel everything Falcon Shield had tried so hard to hide. Months passed after the death of Jonas Mabior, and the investigation into the Gorlang massacre faded once more into silence. The files were locked away, the witnesses relocated or forgotten, and Colonel David Lado found himself isolated, stripped of resources and credibility. His requests for cooperation from international agencies were met with polite rejections. Those who had once supported him now avoided his calls. It was as if an invisible hand had erased the case from the world's attention, one news cycle at a time. Yet Lado refused to forget. Each night he reviewed the remaining fragments of evidence, the damaged hard drives, the transcripts, the photographs of the Black Falcon tattoo. Convinced that somewhere out there, Dr. Miriam Kalo was still alive and waiting for someone to find her. One humid evening in late October, everything changed. A journalist named Ruth Andari, working for an independent media outlet in Nairobi, contacted Lado through an encrypted email. She claimed to have received a mysterious package delivered anonymously to her office. Inside was a small flash drive with a single video file labeled Gorlang Truth. She had verified the metadata. It was recorded just 2 months after the massacre. The sender was untraceable, the address fake. Ruth had watched part of the footage but stopped halfway, horrified by what she saw. She wanted Lado's help to confirm its authenticity. When Lado finally opened the file, the screen flickered with static before revealing a dimly lit room. The camera was shaky as though placed on an unstable surface. In the center of the frame sat Dr. Miriam Kalo. Her face was thinner, her eyes hollow, but unmistakably alive. Behind her were metal walls, likely a storage container or bunker. The sound of generators hummed faintly in the background. She looked straight into the lens and began to speak, her voice trembling, but steady enough to carry the weight of what she had to say. She explained everything she had uncovered. Falcon Shield, she said, had been operating under a new identity, using humanitarian organizations as cover to transport weapons and data for illegal arms deals. Their funding came not only from private clients, but from government contractors seeking to manipulate conflict zones for profit. Gorlang, according to Miriam, had become a target the moment she discovered the falsified cargo manifests. When she confronted Jonas Mabior, she realized too late that he wasn't the ally she thought he was. The massacre was staged to look like tribal violence, so the real culprits could vanish without suspicion. Miriam spoke for nearly 15 minutes, describing names, dates, and coded accounts. She mentioned European companies laundering payments through fake development funds, and a secret meeting in Juba where Falcon Shield executives negotiated with foreign investors. Her final words were haunting. "If you are seeing this, I may already be gone. The people who did this will erase every trace of me, but they cannot erase the truth. It's all in the data drives. Don't let them bury Gorlang." The footage ended abruptly. The camera tilted toward the door as loud footsteps echoed in the background, followed by shouting and gunfire. Then the screen went black. Lado and Ruth watched in silence. Neither spoke for several minutes. They both understood the implications. If the video was real, it exposed a global conspiracy that reached far beyond Sudan's borders. Within hours of viewing it, Ruth uploaded the footage to several secure cloud servers, and sent copies to major international news outlets. By morning, Gorlang truth was being shared across social media. The video went viral, forcing world governments to respond. Protests erupted in Nairobi, London, and Geneva. Human rights organizations demanded investigations. Several officials named in Miriam's testimony resigned abruptly, and a few were detained for questioning. Yet, as quickly as the outrage flared, it began to fade. News stories replaced it, new scandals took over the headlines, and Falcon Shield, now operating under a different alias, quietly disappeared again into the world's shadows. Colonel Lardo was summoned to a closed-door meeting, where he was told to cease his involvement. The matter is being handled diplomatically, they said. He knew what that meant. Silence was being bought. Days later, Ruth Andari's office was ransacked, her computers wiped. She vanished soon after, her phone last traced near the Kenyan border. No one heard from her again. Still, copies of the video survived. They spread across online archives and private servers, impossible to erase completely. A few months later, an anonymous whistleblower released a trove of documents that matched Miriam's statements, proving her words had been true. The files exposed connections between Falcon Shield and several global arms suppliers, confirming what had long been suspected. The Gorlang massacre was not the result of tribal hatred, but of greed. Dr. Miriam Kalo's body was never found. Some believed she was executed the night the video ended, buried in one of the many unmarked graves near the border. Others whispered that she escaped during the chaos, rescued by locals who never revealed her fate. Colonel Lardo, now retired and living in seclusion, still receives unmarked envelopes from unknown senders, photographs, fragments of documents, even a recent image of a woman who looks strikingly like Miriam, walking through a crowded market in Tanzania. He keeps them locked away, not sure whether they are truth or manipulation. The world moved on, as it always does, but in certain corners. In the quiet conversations of investigators, journalists and soldiers, the name Gorlang still lingers. It stands as a symbol of how truth can burn, and how power can silence even the loudest cries for justice. Somewhere, perhaps hidden behind a new identity, a survivor might still be watching, waiting for the world to remember what really happened on that silent night in Sudan, when an entire village disappeared to hide the sins of the powerful.